Welcome back to VSOW.
Hmm.
Today we're taking a deep dive into a really fascinating
Mm.
and often really challenging
Yeah.
part of American history,
Okay.
the relationship between religion and racism.
Mm.
Um, we've got a stack of sources here that explore how the American church has dealt with race all the way from the colonial period up to today.
Right.
You ready to unpack some of this?
Absolutely. I think what's really interesting here is that we're not just going to be looking at historical events.
Right.
We'll be examining the theological arguments that were used, the social movements that arose, and the lived experiences of Black Americans within the context of Christianity.
Mm.
It's a complex story
Yes.
with a lot of layers to peel back.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I think one of the things that struck me when I was going through these sources is how the story starts even before the Civil War.
Hmm.
We tend to think of that as the defining moment,
Right.
but churches were drawing lines around membership and excluding Black people way before that.
That's right. And it's important to remember that even when enslaved people converted to Christianity, it didn't change their condition.
Yeah.
Their baptism didn't make them free. In some ways, you see the church prioritizing social and economic structures over the inherent dignity of all people.
It's almost like they were saying, okay, you can be Christian, but you're still going to be enslaved. That's a really difficult thing to grapple with. And speaking of difficult things to grapple with, our sources use this phrase that I found so striking, dividends over dignity. Essentially the idea that economics fueled the church's complicity in slavery.
It's a stark reality to confront. Many Christians at the time were making a choice to prioritize the financial gains they were getting from slavery
Yeah.
or to stand up for what was morally right.
Right.
Sadly, for many, the dividends won out over the dignity of their fellow human beings.
And then, as you mentioned, comes the Civil War, which wasn't just a national crisis, but a theological one, too. We see in our sources how Christians on both sides were using the Bible to justify their positions.
Yes, and this is where some of those theological arguments we talked about earlier come into play. For example, the concept of biblicism, the belief in the Bible as the ultimate authority, was used by both pro-slavery and abolitionist groups to support their positions.
So you'd have people pointing to passages that seemed to condone slavery, while others focused on the teachings of Jesus about love and compassion. It really highlights how Scripture can be interpreted in very different ways, especially when it comes to complex social issues.
It also raises the question of how much people's pre-existing biases and beliefs influence their interpretations of Scripture. Were they really looking to the Bible for guidance, or were they simply using it to justify what they already believed?
That's a great point, and it makes me think about how we approach these kinds of issues today. Are we truly open to having our perspectives challenged, or are we just looking for confirmation of what we already think? It's something we all need to reflect on.
Absolutely. But let's not forget that even in the midst of all this turmoil and division, there were incredible acts of resistance and resilience within the Black Christian community. One of the most inspiring stories we have is that of Richard Allen and Absalom Jones.
Oh, yes. Their story's just incredible. They were forcibly removed from a white church simply because they dared to sit in the wrong section.
Right.
It's hard to even fathom that kind of blatant discrimination happening in a place of worship.
It's a powerful example of how, even within the church, the forces of racism were at play. But instead of accepting this injustice, Allen and Jones went on to found the first Black denomination in the United States, the African Methodist Episcopal Church.
Talk about turning a negative experience into something positive. They took this act of discrimination and turned it into an opportunity to create their own space, a space where Black people could worship freely and without fear of judgment.
And the impact of that decision is still felt today. The AME Church continues to be a major force in the Black community, not just religiously, but also socially and politically. It's a testament to the power of resilience and self-determination.
It also highlights the importance of representation. Having a church that reflects your own culture and experiences can be incredibly empowering. You see in our sources how this idea of creating spaces for Black voices in leadership continue to emerge throughout history.
Right, and even after the Civil War, with the supposed end of slavery, that struggle for space and recognition didn't stop.
Yeah.
The idea of white supremacy was deeply ingrained in American society, and the church wasn't immune to its influence.
Sadly, it's true. You see this play out in the emergence of the Jim Crow era, with the rise of groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the horrifying practice of lynching. And what's even more disturbing is that many Christians either tolerated these acts or actively participated in them.
It's a dark chapter in American history, and one that the church has to grapple with. How could a faith that preaches love and forgiveness be complicit in such horrific acts of violence and oppression? It's a question that continues to haunt us today.
And it's not just a Southern problem either, which I think is something that often gets overlooked.
Mm,
We tend to think of racism as being concentrated in the South,
right.
but our sources show how it was prevalent in the North as well.
Absolutely. One of the most poignant examples of this is the story of Augustus Tolton, a Black man who was denied the opportunity to become a priest in the North simply because of his race. He was forced to go all the way to Rome to study, and when he returned to America, he became the first known Black priest in the country. His story really speaks to the systemic nature of racism and how it permeated every aspect of society, even the church.
His perseverance is remarkable. Imagine being told you can't fulfill your calling just because of the color of your skin. It's a testament to his faith and his unwavering determination to serve God and his community.
And his story is just one of many that highlight the challenges and triumphs of Black Catholics in America. It's a part of history that often gets overshadowed, but it's just as important, just as compelling.
We often think of the civil rights movement as a turning point in the fight for racial equality, and in many ways it was. But even during that time, the church's role was complex and often contradictory. You have figures like Billy Graham, who are incredibly influential, but who also adopted moderate stances that didn't always align with the more radical calls for justice being made by civil rights leaders.
It's important to note that Graham's approach was seen by some as a way to maintain peace and unity, while others viewed it as upholding a system that continued to disadvantage Black Americans. It's a debate that continues to this day. How should the church balance its commitment to social justice with its desire for peace and harmony?
It's a tough question, and there are no easy answers.
Mm.
But it's one that we have to keep asking ourselves, especially as we continue to grapple with issues of race and equality in our own time.
And that leads us to another important development that we see in our sources: the rise of the religious right, a political movement that often used religious beliefs to unite Christians, but not always in ways that actively promoted racial equality.
Right, and you see this reflected in some of the candidates they supported who may have aligned with certain moral values, but who didn't necessarily have a track record of working towards racial justice. It raises the question of whether political expediency sometimes overshadows the deeper moral imperative of fighting for equality for all people.
It's a tension that's still very much present today, as we see with the Black Lives Matter movement and the mixed reactions it received within the church. Some Christian leaders were ostracized for supporting the movement, while others embraced it as a continuation of the struggle for racial justice that has been going on for centuries.
It seems like this tension, this struggle to reconcile faith with the realities of racism in America, is a recurring theme throughout history. But before we get too deep into that, let's take a moment to pause and reflect on what we've learned so far. We've covered a lot of ground, from the early days of slavery to the civil rights movement and beyond.
And it's clear that the path toward racial justice within the American church has been anything but straightforward. There have been moments of progress and moments of regression, times of courage and times of complicity.
But one thing that stands out to me is the incredible resilience of the Black Christian community. Despite facing incredible adversity and discrimination, they never gave up on their faith or their fight for equality.
That's right. And their stories serve as a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope and faith can endure. And that's a message that I think we can all draw strength from, no matter what challenges we may face in our own lives.
Exactly. And speaking of challenges, we're going to shift gears a bit in the next part of our deep dive and look at a model that's been developed to help individuals and communities work towards racial justice. It's called the ARC of Racial Justice, and I think you're going to find it really insightful.
Okay, so we've seen how deeply intertwined religion and racism are in American history, with the church playing a complex and often contradictory role.
Yeah, it's a lot to process, and it can feel overwhelming, right? Like, where
Yeah.
do we even begin to address something so deeply rooted?
That's where I think this ARC of racial justice model comes in.
Okay.
It gives us a framework, a place to start. And what I find helpful is that it breaks things down into these three key areas: awareness, relationships, and commitment.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. What does awareness actually look like in this context?
Well, first and foremost, it means understanding the history we've been talking about. recognizing the ways that racism has been embedded in our institutions, in our laws, and yes, even in our churches.
It's like you were saying earlier about those pro-slavery arguments that twisted the Bible's teachings. That lack of awareness, or maybe even willful ignorance of the true message of compassion and equality, is what allowed those arguments to take hold.
Exactly. And it's not just about the past either. Awareness also means being attuned to how racism manifests in our society today, recognizing those subtle biases, the microaggressions, the systemic inequalities that continue to disadvantage people of color.
So it's not enough to just read a book or watch a documentary. We need to be actively engaged with the world around us, paying attention to how these issues are playing out in real time.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the next element, relationships.
Okay.
Because awareness without relationships can lead to this kind of intellectualized understanding of racism, but it doesn't necessarily translate into action.
It's like the difference between knowing something in your head and truly feeling it in your heart.
That's a great way to put it. Because building relationships with people from different racial and cultural backgrounds forces us to confront our own biases, to listen to different perspectives, to empathize with experiences that might be different from our own.
It's about moving beyond our comfort zones, right? Not just surrounding ourselves with people who look and think like us.
Exactly. And this is something that our sources emphasize over and over again, the importance of interracial dialogue, of cross-cultural understanding. Because it's in those spaces, those uncomfortable, sometimes challenging conversations, that true growth and transformation can happen.
You know, I keep thinking back to the story of Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. Their forced removal from that white church wasn't just an act of discrimination. It was a missed opportunity for connection, for understanding.
That's such an important point. Imagine if, instead of being ostracized, they had been welcomed, if their voices had been heard, if a genuine relationship had been formed. Who knows what kind of positive change could have come from that?
It makes you wonder how many other opportunities for connection and understanding have been lost because of fear or prejudice or just plain inertia.
And that's why this relationship piece is so crucial. Because it's in those authentic connections that we start to see each other not as representatives of some racial category, but as human beings with shared hopes, fears, and dreams.
Okay, so we've talked about awareness, we've talked about relationships. What about commitment? How does that fit into this model?
Well, this is where the rubber meets the road, so to speak.
Yeah.
Because awareness and relationships, as important as they are not enough on their own. We have to be willing to take action, to challenge injustice, to dismantle those systems of oppression that we've been talking about.
So what does that action look like? What are some concrete steps that people can take?
It can take many forms, and it's going to look different for each person depending on their circumstances and their sphere of influence. But some of the examples we see in our sources include things like supporting organizations that are working to promote racial justice, advocating for policies that address systemic inequalities, speaking out against racism whenever you encounter it, and using your platform, however big or small, to amplify the voices of those who are marginalized.
I love that you mentioned using your platform. In today's world, with social media and the internet, everyone has the potential to reach a wider audience. And that means we all have a responsibility to use that platform for good, to speak out against injustice, and to amplify the voices of those who are fighting for change.
Absolutely. But it's not just about what we do publicly. It's also about the choices we make in our personal lives. Who are we surrounding ourselves with? Who are we supporting with our time and our money? Are we actively challenging racist jokes or comments when we hear them? These seemingly small actions can make a big difference in creating a more just and equitable world.
You know, I'm struck by how this ARC model, while it's specifically focused on racial justice, really applies to so many other areas of life as well. Whether we're talking about gender equality, LGBTQ+ rights, environmental justice, or any other issue where systemic inequalities exist.
I think you're right. It's a framework that can be adapted and applied to any situation where we're trying to create a more just and equitable world, and that's what makes it so powerful.
So for our listeners who are processing all of this, who maybe feel overwhelmed by the scope of the problem, what would you say to them? Where do we even begin?
Well, I think the most important thing is to not get discouraged.
Right.
Change happens incrementally, one step at a time.
Mhm.
And every action, no matter how small, contributes to that larger movement towards justice. So start with where you are, with what you're passionate about, and find ways to make a difference in your own community.
I love that. It's a reminder that we don't have to wait for some grand gesture, some heroic act. Change starts with each of us in our everyday lives, making conscious choices to challenge injustice and to create a more equitable world.
And remember, you're not alone in this. There are countless individuals and organizations out there who are working tirelessly for racial justice. Connect with them, learn from them, and find strength and support in their work.
It's like that saying, justice is what love looks like in public. It's not just a feeling, it's a commitment to action, to making a difference in the world. And the more people who join that movement, the stronger it becomes.
And the more hope we have for creating a future where all people are treated with dignity, respect, and equality.
Well said. We've been talking about this ARC model, but I'm curious, how did this model come about? What are its roots?
It's actually quite interesting. The ARC model wasn't developed by academics or scholars, but rather by practitioners, by people who are on the front lines of the fight for racial justice.
Oh, wow. So it's grounded in real-world experience.
Absolutely. It emerged from the work of organizations like the YWCA and Race Forward, who were grappling with the complexities of racial justice work and looking for a framework that could guide their efforts.
So it's not just a theoretical model. It's been tested and refined through years of on-the-ground experience.
Exactly. And that's why I think it's so effective. It's not some pie-in-the-sky ideal. It's a practical roadmap for creating meaningful change.
And it acknowledges that this work is ongoing, right? It's not about achieving some kind of end goal, but rather about continually striving to create a more just and equitable world.
That's right. It's about embracing the journey, the process of learning, growing, and transforming both ourselves and the systems around us.
As we've been talking about this model, I've been reflecting on my own experiences and thinking about how I can apply these principles in my own life. And one thing that keeps coming to mind is the importance of education.
I think that's a great place to start. Because the more we understand about the history of racism, the different ways it manifests, the systemic inequalities that are baked into our society, the better equipped we are to challenge it.
And education isn't just about reading books or taking classes. It's about engaging with diverse perspectives, listening to the lived experiences of people of color, and being willing to have those uncomfortable conversations that can sometimes lead to real growth and understanding.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important to remember that education is an ongoing process. It's not something we do once and then we're done. It's a lifelong journey of learning, unlearning, and relearning.
I love that you said unlearning, because sometimes the most challenging part of this work is confronting the biases and assumptions that we've internalized over a lifetime, those unconscious beliefs that can perpetuate racism without us even realizing it.
And that unlearning process can be painful, it can be messy, but it's absolutely essential if we want to create a more just and equitable world.
So as we move towards wrapping up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a few questions to reflect on. First, where do you see yourself on this ARC of racial justice? Are you primarily in the awareness stage, the relationship stage, or the commitment stage?
And what are some concrete actions you can take to move further along that arc? What are your strengths and where are your growth areas?
And finally, who are the people in your life who can support you on this journey? Who are the allies you can connect with, learn from, and work alongside?
These are tough questions, but they're questions that we all need to be asking ourselves if we're serious about dismantling racism and creating a more just and equitable world.
And remember, this work isn't just about achieving some abstract goal. It's about making a difference in the lives of real people, right here, right now.
It's about creating a world where everyone, regardless of their race or ethnicity, has the opportunity to thrive and to reach their full potential.
And that's a future worth fighting for. As we're talking about this work of racial justice, it strikes me that it's not just about changing laws or policies. It's about changing hearts and minds.
Right.
And one of the most powerful tools we have for doing that is storytelling.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
Stories have this incredible ability to cut through the noise and connect with us on a deeper level. They humanize issues.
Right.
They create empathy, and they inspire action.
Think about the stories we've encountered in our sources, like the story of Richard Allen and Absalom Jones being forced out of that church. It's one thing to hear about segregation and discrimination in the abstract.
Right.
But when you hear a personal story like that, it really hits home.
Exactly. And it's not just historical stories either.
Yeah.
We need to be listening to the stories of people of color today, hearing about their lived experiences with racism, understanding the challenges they face, and amplifying their voices.
One story that really impacted me when I was reading through these sources was the story of Emmett Till, this young black boy who was brutally murdered for allegedly whistling at a white woman. It's a horrific story. And it's a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of racial hatred.
His story became a catalyst for the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
And it continues to resonate today as a symbol of the systemic racism and injustice that still permeates our society.
It's heartbreaking to think that stories like Emmett Till's are not just relics of the past,
Right.
but are still happening today.
Mm-hmm.
We see it in the countless cases of police brutality,
Yeah.
in the racial disparities in our healthcare and education systems, in the everyday microaggressions that people of color experience.
And that's why it's so important to not only listen to these stories,
Right.
but to share them, to educate others, to use our platforms to raise awareness and to demand justice.
It's about creating a culture where these stories are not silenced or ignored, but are instead amplified and used as a catalyst for change.
Because silence in the face of injustice is complicity.
Yeah.
We all have a responsibility to speak out against racism, to challenge prejudice wherever we encounter it, and to work towards creating a more just and equitable world.
You know, this deep dive has really challenged me to think about my own role in this work of racial justice. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the enormity of the problem, but I keep coming back to that idea of focusing on what we can control, on making a difference in our own spheres of influence.
I think that's a really healthy and productive approach. Because change doesn't happen overnight.
Right.
It happens one conversation at a time, one relationship at a time, one action at a time.
And it's a journey we all have to take together. There's no one right way to do this work. But the important thing is that we're all moving in the same direction,
Right.
towards a future where racism is no longer a barrier to opportunity or a threat to human dignity.
And as we continue on this journey, I think it's important to remember that we don't have to have all the answers.
Right?
We don't have to be perfect, but we do have to be willing to learn, to grow, and to keep showing up.
Well said. And I think that's a great place to leave our listeners. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from the historical roots of racism in America to the practical steps we can take to dismantle it.
We've explored the complexities of the church's role in this struggle, and we've introduced the ARC of racial justice model as a framework for guiding our actions.
But ultimately, this work is about more than just models or frameworks. It's about a commitment to love,
Right.
to justice, and to the inherent dignity of all people.
And as W.B. Du Bois said, the cost of liberty is less than the price of repression. Let's choose the path of liberty, the path of justice, the path of love.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the complex and often challenging relationship between religion and racism in America. We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking.
And remember, this conversation doesn't end here. Keep learning, keep engaging, and keep working towards a more just and equitable world.
If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment with your biggest takeaway. We'd love to hear from you and continue the conversation.
And until next time, keep diving deep.
Thanks for listening to VSOW.